Doctor. As we showed interest in our newly appointed colleague, who would feel at home and easily integrate into the community, our retired professor came to mind like a lifeline. We found him in his usual corner at the local restaurant, reading his newspaper. Driven by our close friendship, we immediately surrounded him, introduced our new friend, and asked him to tell us about the region. Being local, we naturally assumed he would share his knowledge. When he began speaking with his broad perspective, we quickly realized our mistake. What makes a place valuable are its inhabitants, he began. As the old saying goes, a place derives its honor from the people who inhabit it. I don't know how true this saying is. Even before our ancestors arrived here, books were written about the fertility of these lands. People, drawing on the richness of this land, with its gardens of all kinds of vegetables and fruits, formed numerous small settlements in the plains and on the mountainsides, from the foothills to the summits. A geographer of 2,000 years ago described this multitude with the fabled term, 1,000 villages. However, certain sections of the valley, through which a stream flows, occasionally became wetlands due to the low elevation and heavy rainfall. Furthermore, some court records recorded in the court records concerned violations of water use. The abundance of water, however, was appreciated by the farming population, leading them to prioritize rice cultivation among their crops. Thus, the locals boasted that the country's highest quality rice was grown in this region. However, a century ago, one of the major problems the new regime had to solve was related to this issue. My friend next to me asked in surprise, "Was it about rice?" Quote. I couldn't tell if our teacher smiled faintly, but his answer to the question wasn't immediate. Efforts to reach the level of modern civilization had begun a century earlier, but the decade before the regime change witnessed heavy wars, where those who had left, the subject of lamentations, never returned. Therefore, the issue of deserters was a prominent political problem. It wouldn't be wrong to liken the country to a smoking ruin when the war ended. The newly formed new administration faced a society that had lost its workforce due to epidemics and poverty. During the reconstruction process, more than 80 gangs challenged the authority, along with elements that occasionally attempted rebellion, making it necessary to take security measures. However, the general public health problem posed a serious obstacle to the country's future, economic development, and progress. In this story, linked to the legend of the phoenix rising from the ashes, I see many virtually nameless heroes who dedicated their lives to society. He took a breath before continuing his story about the rice we'd forgotten. The wise leaders of the young republic understood the gravity of the problem. They had experienced firsthand that the number of deaths in wars could not be compared to the number of deaths from epidemics. When faced with the fact that almost half the country was sick, they did not hesitate to appoint a completely unconventional, transparent individual to lead the problem. This man always had his sleeves rolled up. He used the vast knowledge and experience he had gained during the old regime in the service of the new regime, whose founding he had actively participated in, until his last breath. For him, it was salus populi suprema lex esto. In other words, the health of the people is the supreme law. He went down in history as one of the rare figures who combined his medical identity with statesmanship. However, he was an exceptional figure in difficult times that could overcome him. He had no time to waste and, first and foremost, drew the country's health map. Every undertaking required planning and long-term efforts. He demonstrated remarkable performance in vital matters, such as the resettlement of nearly 2 million migrants, the rehabilitation of the wounded, the fight against epidemics, and social problems. In a relatively short period, the number of physicians, nurses, midwives, and health officials doubled. The ministry's budget constituted a significant portion of the poor government's budget. Health-related laws and regulations were drafted and enacted to establish the legal infrastructure. In short, the foundations of the country's health system were laid during his term. He paused for a moment to catch his breath. In the early 1920s, many infectious diseases, including malaria, tuberculosis, syphilis, trachoma, typhoid, dysentery, and leprosy, were rampant in the country. Wars, massive migrations, and population movements led to an increase in the diversity and rate of spread of epidemics. A long-term, extensive, and challenging struggle was waged nationwide against epidemics. Malaria of these diseases had been a major scourge since ancient times, flaring up in periods of adverse factors such as war, social unrest, and economic collapse, inflicting immense damage on humanity. Not only ordinary people, but also kings, popes, prominent figures in society, and even cities and kingdoms fell victim to malaria. During his ministry, 17 million people were screened for malaria, and 5 million were treated. 7 tons of free medicine imported from abroad were distributed for this purpose. Again, during the same period, as part of the fight against the disease, 1,000 kilometers of water drainage channels were opened, and 350 square kilometers of swampy land were dried, including this geography in which we live. Trachoma, a long-known disease that causes blindness, was a major health problem in the early years of the Republic's founding. It was said that almost half of the population in the southeast had contracted the disease, and that towns had become towns of the blind. Trachoma hospitals were opened. Initially, the number of trachoma cases treated was around 3,000, but within 20 years, this number had reached 120,000. Through intensive treatment efforts, the rate of new cases among those examined was reduced to almost 1/4. Within 20 years of screening conducted by the syphilis control teams, approximately 2,250,000 people were examined, and 86,000 of them were found to have syphilis. Smallpox cases among refugees in 1929 and 1930 caused epidemics in some parts of the country. Consequently, a major fight against smallpox was launched. As a result of the control of border crossings and intensive vaccination and treatment efforts, smallpox was completely brought under control within a few years. Cholera epidemics that broke out in neighboring countries were prevented from spreading to the country through measures taken. Following a cholera outbreak in the Far East in 1939, 1 million doses of cholera vaccine produced in the laboratories of the Central Hygiene Institute were sent to China. During the War of Independence, difficulties were encountered in vaccination and treatment efforts against rabies in the country. To find a solution, a colleague who had previously worked at a treatment center during the war was sent from the new capital to the imperial capital at his direction. This intrepid man secretly procured an infected rabbit from the doctor in charge of the treatment center in the Ottoman capital. By transferring it from one to another and evading the pursuit of the British police, he brought it to the new capital, thus establishing the first rabies-related institution there. Later, in the early years of the new regime, rabies dispensaries were opened in various cities across the country. Additionally, numerous rabies vaccination stations were established in various regions of the country. When he was offered the prime ministership by the president, he accepted it on the condition that he would not take the country to war unless absolutely necessary. During his tenure, earthquakes and floods, which caused great loss of life and devastated the entire region, shook the country to its core. With the outbreak of World War II, and driven by military experience and a determination to stay away from war, partial mobilization was declared in the country, and more than 1 million young working-age people were conscripted as a precaution. As a requirement of the principle of populism, one of the regime's ultimate goals, he prioritized the implementation of the principle of etatism. Despite the economic hardships brought about by the war, investments in public health and medical education contributed to the strengthening of the country's social state structure in the long run. However, under the harsh economic conditions brought on by the war, a law was passed granting the state extensive powers to intervene in the economy. This law granted the government the authority to seize people's property, regulate prices, increase working hours, and abolish holidays. However, a shortage of production equipment, transportation, and import restrictions disrupted the supply-demand balance, leading to problems such as inflation and black marketeering. The war-induced deterioration of the country's economic situation reached unbearable proportions for the people. With the outbreak of the war, the country's economic infrastructure was inadequate, prompting the government to take radical measures. Furthermore, the excesses and abuses in its implementation led to widespread public dissatisfaction. This was an unfortunate example of how well-intentioned policy can lead to negative consequences due to inadequate implementation and oversight. While the law made the country adequately prepared for war, its consequences were disastrous for the people. Food was confiscated from the people, at the risk of starvation, but due to incompetent collection and storage, this food rotted on the roadside or in warehouses. The public's perception of this fueled their anger at the government, blaming it for everything that had happened. Some civil servants and party leaders abused the law, selling vehicles, property, and foodstuffs they had seized from the public to themselves, and by collaborating with hoarders, they had profited materially at the public's expense. This situation undoubtedly eroded public trust to its core. Naturally, when the government seized food and consumer goods, prices soared, and the black market became widespread. Eventually, rationing began for basic food items like bread and sugar. The black market could not be stopped, and the government failed to combat it. But all else aside, he was one of those who knew well how close death was to people, and his premonition told him that the angel of death, whom he always encountered for others, had finally come for him. With the kindness of his soul, he asked his assistant to, quote, call a doctor without causing a stir. However, the doctor, who arrived shortly thereafter, saw there was nothing he could do, The state had lost its man. I don't know if he ever felt peace in his life, but I imagine he found peace, even if only for a moment, as he passed from that state of tranquility, still aware of what was happening around him, into eternal sleep. Naturally, the country plunged into mourning. Flags were lowered to half-mast. State dignitaries and a large crowd attended the ceremony. Following the funeral prayer, his body was brought to the Ministry of Health. Following the final ceremony there, he was buried in his final resting place in the Asri Cemetery. We held our breath for a brief, deathly silence. It may have lasted only a few seconds, but for some reason, it seemed long to us. He placed great importance on the sciences of preventative medicine and public health, and on imparting the knowledge gained through them to the nation's physicians and applying them in the field. The name of the Central Hygiene Institute, his dream and greatest achievement, was changed by law after his death to include the name of the late Prime Minister. However, nearly 90 years after its founding, the institute's closure, following long-standing administrative, technical, and financial difficulties, resulted in the loss of a long-established public health institution in the country, and a serious weakening of its capabilities through the loss of its memory in the field of preventative health. In other words, not only was an institution closed, but Hygeia's cup was overturned, Panakia's elixir dried up, and Asclepius's staff was thrown to the ground. His ability to empathize with his patients, expected of a doctor, had expanded into empathy with an ailing society, a quality that expanded upon his becoming a statesman. My young mind cannot grasp what this was like. The ability to understand patients' pain and concerns, and to approach them with compassion, has now spread to embrace all people in the country, suggesting a mature state of mind that can only be encountered in this profession, but is inconceivable. Silence continued until our new friend excused himself and left us. In the text of Hippocrates' oath, we see a goal whose very existence lies within itself. However, just as private healthcare institutions, which erode this oath through the dilemma of wallet and conscience, exploit the state's desperate need for healthy generations for the sake of its population policy, so too does the state's need for healthy generations. The relationship between health policies implemented in the first decade of the Republic and population growth provides a concrete basis for the statement. In 10 years, we created 15 million young people of all ages. The phrase, 15 million young people, represents the new generation born during this period, who managed to survive and grow up healthy. This meant not just a number, but also the revitalization of the country's human resources potential and the flourishing of hopes for the future. In this context, this verse from the anthem emphasizes the demographic strengthening that emerged as a direct result of healthcare services. The population had drastically decreased, and life expectancy had shortened due to epidemics, malnutrition, war, and migration. For the newly established Republican regime, a healthy and strong population was vital to the country's reconstruction and development. A strong national defense and a strong economy needed healthy generations, and a robust healthcare system was essential for healthy generations. I can't help but admire how successfully he combined his roles as statesman and healthcare provider without conflict. It wouldn't be wrong to consider the celibacy law proposals, which were occasionally put forward like a hot potato and received strong cultural support, as part of the population policy of the time. The fact that absurd proposals, such as taxing men and women of marriageable age if they were single, were put forward, could be considered a sign, to put it humorously, that the MPs of the time weren't entirely idle. Meanwhile, in the last 10 years, there has been a 71% increase in the number of people living alone. The government is still implementing measures to encourage marriage. As far as I know, our retired professor didn't have a completely statist or liberal perspective, which evoked a similar dilemma. He simply considered human health indisputable, attributing it to its sacredness. His former analogy with Prometheus tragically reflected the fact that he received his reward not from Zeus, but from the people to whom he brought fire. It was undoubtedly inevitable, as always, that he would bring the issue to the present day. And indeed, that's what happened. Last year, during my time as a hospital companion, I worked closely with patients, nurses, and doctors, and came to know that world a little better. The respect I felt for the healthcare professionals, who, during long working hours, rushed to relieve the suffering of patients with an unflagging energy, as if they never tire, ensured I never despaired of humanity. The doctor I had encountered there as a relative also lived across the street from my temporary residence. We had met him in the hallway a couple of times and exchanged greetings. He was middle-aged. Occasionally, opportunities arose for conversation, even with flimsy excuses. Realizing he was studying German, he occasionally found an excuse to exchange pleasantries. Guten Tag, wie geht es dir? He'd respond with a faint smile. Mir geht es gut, wie geht es dir? A slight nod. Of course, that was all. Violence against healthcare personnel has existed everywhere and always, but never has it been as widespread as it is today. However, while visible measures were being taken in foreign countries, doctors' social media posts revealed that these people were left remarkably unattended in our country. Far from taking measures against violence, the government, along with its representatives, occasionally made statements and actions that gave the impression of discrediting them. On the one hand, accusations bordering on treason against those leaving the country were circulated side by side with statements from representatives encouraging the strangling of doctors. An incomprehensible mindset that explained the freedom we had achieved at the time by beating doctors was finding expression in a peculiar segment of society. After this revealing information, our old friend turned back to his hero. But I could sense his hesitation, his uncertainty about whether to leave. He was resolute, and I was clearly having a hard time accepting the hesitation I felt. These people, as is likely the requirement of their profession, would have assessed every aspect of the situation, made quick decisions, and taken immediate action. But despite his foreign language skills, he harbored a certain uncertainty. It was inevitable that the healthcare system would suffer from the preferences of doctors migrating abroad, and this was happening. Blaming them for this was completely unfair. Our elderly friend continued to talk about his experiences during his hospital days. That night, I felt a deceptive monotony, a déjà vu I'd experienced in the past. I realized my patient had fallen asleep in the dim light and the brief interval his suffering somehow allowed. Looking out the door into the corridor, I felt a sense of dread that an ominous scream would shatter the silence of that restless night at any moment. I don't know if it was just me, but I immediately realized that the cursed sound was real, and the source of the problem wasn't the palliative care unit for the hopeless in the long corridor I was in. The sounds were coming from quite a distance, but I couldn't tell what they were. The source of the incessant shouting and noise was probably the emergency room on the ground floor. It couldn't be any other way. I turned and looked at my patient again. He was asleep, lost in a pendulum oscillating between peace and restlessness. I quietly and quickly crossed the endless corridor and reached the stairs between floors. The police had arrived and intervened in the clash just moments before. They were checking IDs and releasing the patient's relatives. Less ahead, I saw the doctor, his face pale. His seemingly calm demeanor and movements still lacked any apparent determination. Returning to my patient without delay, I found him just as I had left him, in a restless sleep, the sedatives having worn off. One of us chimed in, demonstrating that he wasn't indifferent to the issue. Thousands of countless healthcare workers are subjected to violence all over the world, at all times. These incidents often stem from long waiting times, misunderstandings, or dissatisfaction with treatment outcomes on the part of patient families. The pandemic played a significant role in the rise of such behavior. Economic hardship, social tensions, and general intolerance make healthcare workers easy targets. Furthermore, the lack of deterrent or swift enforcement of penalties for violent incidents can also encourage such behavior. Our elderly friend nodded in agreement and continued his speech. You are absolutely right. The emotional distress, fear, or helplessness experienced by patients' families can sometimes turn into unjustified anger toward doctors. However, despite the profession's ethical idealism, burnout syndrome caused by harsh working conditions is also inevitable. I don't think the doctor I mentioned underwent an internal transformation or gained new meaning in his profession after this experience. It's likely he simply reviewed the changing conditions. Our colleague, who interjected earlier, demonstrated his expertise in this area by shifting the conversation to private hospitals, better living conditions, and a lower risk of violence abroad, as in your example. Encourage them to learn the language. Low salaries and harsh working conditions, especially for young doctors, make private hospitals attractive first, and then abroad. Private hospitals offer higher salaries, lower patient loads, and better working conditions. Furthermore, the lower reporting of violent incidents gives doctors the perception of a safer environment. It's argued that violence leads doctors to move to the private sector, but this reduces the quality of education and creates specialization problems due to the migration of experienced doctors. The more controlled environment and lower patient volumes of private hospitals are seen as factors that reduce the risk of violence. Consequently, these violent incidents left doctors feeling helpless and triggered a search for a safe work environment. I could tell I felt the topic was drifting apart. I felt some questions were left unanswered. Granted, the situation in private hospitals was a social reality, but the flow and coherence of the conversation had been disrupted. I was curious about the situation of the patient and the doctor. However, I didn't have the opportunity to ask our elderly friend these questions, which were ingrained in my mind, until later. With the changing economic system following the 1980 coup, the number of private hospitals has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. These hospitals generally cater to higher income groups and may require out-of-pocket payments, except for services contracted with the Social Security Institution, SGK. This can lead to a more elite profile for patients and their families. Appointments in private hospitals are shorter, waiting times are shorter, and time allocated per patient is more. However, violence is often portrayed as non-existent in private hospitals, but the reality is otherwise. Incidents in private hospitals are either underreported or remain hidden from the public for fear of protecting their brand image. Our old friends seem to be murmuring a situation no less than a harbinger of dystopia. Factors such as healthcare reforms and overcrowding in emergency rooms have emerged as triggers for violence. According to ministry data, thousands of healthcare workers are subjected to violence every year. The number of doctors who have received good conduct certificates and emigrated has increased 40-fold in the past decade. Healthcare workers were found to be 16 times more likely to be subjected to violence than those in other professions. Today, migrations continue due to despair, burnout, and insecurity. This reality, contradicting the spirit of the ideal, is like a blank page on a white coat. It's as if the pain of violence were the sparks of cruelty that manifested itself in the institutional darkness, where a mechanized lack of empathy has become a heartless routine.